All right, in this video, we'll talk about what promise.race is, and we'll also write our own polyfill. So the prereq is that you know what promises are, and you know that then, and all of that stuff. Cool. So here I have two URLs from JSON placeholder. Here I have a custom promise that resolves in 100 milliseconds, and one that resolves in 200 milliseconds. And then my promises 3 and 4 will just be the result of me fetching URLs 1 and URLs 2. Okay, so if I do capital P promise.race, now notice capital P promise is the promise constructor function, right? And .race is actually a static method that lives on this constructor, okay? And it takes in an array of promises. So if I do promise, let me just copy this, promise 1, promise 2, promise 3, and promise 4, I'm not going to get anything because remember, you need to do the .then. .then, we get the data back, data, and then I'm going to console.log my data. Okay, so we see that we got the placeholder from users because that was the one that finished first. Now, if I go to my promise 1, instead of resolving it in 100 milliseconds, if I resolve it in 10 milliseconds, you're going to see that promise 1 will be done first. If instead of promise 2 resolving in 200 milliseconds, I change it to 2, you're going to see that promise 2 will be done first. So let me change it back. And even with these, sometimes you see that the users will be done first, but sometimes the posts will be done first, right? So whenever you're fetching a URL, you actually don't know which one will arrive first. Okay, so that's how promise.race works. It waits for the first one to resolve. Okay, now what happens if we do reject? What if this rejects in 2 seconds? Okay, what happens if we reject it in 2000 milliseconds? Okay, so now even though this rejects, it's just waiting for the first one to settle or be done. Okay, so promise.race will return either the resolved or reject depending on whichever one finishes first. Okay, since this does not finish first, it gets ignored. If it does finish first, we see that it got caught. Okay, okay, let's write our own implementation. Okay, I'll delete this. Write our own function. Let's call this my promise race, and it will take in an array of promises. First, I'm just going to console.log and say it's my own polyfill. Yay. Okay. Now, in order for this to actually work correctly, you need to return a new promise. And this promise gives you access to 2 functions, right? Resolve and reject. Then we're going to open this up. Okay, so we're going to return a promise object, but inside of that object, we're going to take our argument, the array of promises. And since it's an array, we can do a for each loop through it. So for each promise. For each promise, what am I going to do? I'm going to call the promise constructor, and I'm going to resolve this promise. Okay, so here, let me make it more clear. We have an array of promise 1, promise 2, and promise 3. This will wrap everything inside of a promise object, right? And then what it's going to do, oh my God, I can't delete that. Okay, what it's going to do is it's going to go through each one, and it's going to run each one's resolve function. It does not resolve it right away, which a lot of people get confused. So it's going to go to promise 1, and it's going to say, hey, how does your resolve function work? And promise 1 will say, oh, my resolve function works within a set timeout after 100 milliseconds. Same thing with promise 2, but in 2 milliseconds. For promise 3, oh, my resolve is not within a set timeout. It's whenever I get a response when I fetch the URL. Okay, so that's what this does. Resolve does not mean it resolves right away. Resolve means it calls the promises resolve function. Okay, so now after that resolve function finishes resolving, we can do a .then. Okay, .then we have the data, and then now we can also promise.resolve the data itself, right? But how are we going to do that? Well, since we're within the new promise wrapper, we can just say resolve data. And then we can do catch, error, and then we can also console.log. I don't know why I messed that up. Console.log error. Okay, or even better, we can just reject it. Okay, now you can even do it like this. This is the shortcut. Okay, so since you're already getting the data returned, instead of saying res data, you can simply just say res like this. So exactly how does this work? It's going to run all of these concurrently, right? It's going to say, okay, run this resolve function, run this resolve function, run this resolve function. But then as soon as any of these finishes resolving, then the outer promise itself resolves. And that's what this does right here. Same with catch. Okay. And when the outer one resolves, then we're done. Okay, so now we can do my promise race, doing promise 1, let me copy, promise 1, promise 2, promise 3, and promise 4. And we can do .then, and then we just console.log because we get the data returned. Okay, promise 2. Okay, we see that since this was reject, let's change this to resolve 200. So if I change it to 200, you see that the post will win, right? If I change it to 20, promise 2 is done. If instead I reject, promise 2 is rejected. Okay. All right, I hope that was useful.